the videos I put out, I probably have a Google Doc
Mhm.
of I think it's at like 300 ideas, and it's just stuff that it's having the presence of mind to jot down things as you're going through your day, because there's so much content out there.
Hey, friends, welcome to Smart Venture Podcast, the best information for future CEOs. Starting a company is easy, but growing and managing it is hard. In this podcast, we sit down with the best founders, experienced leaders, and investors in tech and relevant space to give you the best tips to grow your company and grow yourself. Some of our most popular episodes are about crypto founders and investors. Check out our new podcast called Keeping Up with Crypto on YouTube, iTunes, and Spotify. If you like it, don't forget to subscribe and give it a 5-star. This episode is brought to you by Momento NFT. Momento NFT is a direct-to-fan social NFT app that allows fans to own viral moments from their favorite creators and unlock perks like meet and greets, autographed merchandise, and more. As a creator, you can easily create valuable images and video NFTs of your best social content. And as a fan, you can own viral moments from your favorite creators and unlock perks like meet and greets. Momento NFT is backed by Animoca brand, Cadenza, and Mark Pincus. Check out the app available on App Store and Google Play.
Thank you so much, Wayne, for coming on the show today.
Yeah, thanks for having me.
Your videos are like amazing.
Oh,
For
thank
the
you.
for the audience who doesn't know, like definitely check out Wayne's YouTube channel. It's like literally one of the best like YouTube resources out there.
Yeah, I
And
appreciate it.
yeah, like I mean, I feel like it's just like both like the quality of the content as well as like the quality of the video is like 10 out of 10.
Wow, that's so nice. Yeah, I'm still in the early days, still trying to learn. So thank you. I really appreciate the early encouragement.
So to start off the show, like would you want to share a little bit more about like how you got to where you are? You literally work at all the top companies like tech company like Google or like KPCB or like top venture fund, as well as you've worked on I believe like McKinsey and basically literally just like all the big brands. It's on your resume. It's really impressive. Now you are at SignalFire and in a venture fund. Do you want to tell us more about like how you grew up and how you got to where you are today?
Yeah, happy to. So, I have to say those logos were they were not household names for me growing up growing up in the Midwest, raised by parents from rural Taiwan.
Mhm.
And so I was I had no idea what consulting, banking, venture capital, any of this stuff was. But what I did know was I wanted to work on I basically wanted to follow the people who were best at the things that I wanted to get good at. And I knew that I was, kind of a math nerd growing up, very much in my own head. I wanted to work on being more articulate. And when I was in college, I basically saw like, what are the smoothest talkers? What jobs are they going into? And that was McKinsey. So that's kind of why I went there. And from that standpoint, it was actually a really great learning experience. The other thing I learned when I was there is I want to do the exact opposite of working with large bureaucratic Fortune 500 companies growing 2% a year. And that is kind of what drove me into the loving arms of startups. And, when I was working with founders, that's kind of when I really fell in love with entrepreneurship and sort of, the craft of helping founders. And so when I realized I could actually make that a full-time job in venture capital, I sort of sprung into action. I managed to get a foot in the door at Kleiner Perkins, and then eventually made my way to SignalFire, where I've been for 8 years. And it's been my dream job since.
Yeah, like I mean, okay, so I have to say, I think like you made it sounds really easy. I think like you going into Princeton or like McKinsey or KPCB or like Google or like now even SignalFire. Like I feel like every step of the way it's like a really competitive situation. How did your drive come from? Was it from like your parents or like was it like some sort of like experience that kind of like shaped you into becoming super ambitious?
There's I guess there's a few things I'd pull apart. One is the innate desire to kind of help, and my admiration for founders, where it comes from. I think the kernel of entrepreneurship to me is the pursuit of opportunity without regard to your resources. And to me, the immigrant journey, the American dream, is kind of the epitome of that. And so having been raised by parents who kind of came from, rural Taiwan, I think that was probably something that resonated with me. Helping founders who are literally trying to do the impossible, right, and building their companies. In terms of my ambition, I think it's hard to say. I think at some level, part of it is learned behavior from my parents who are definitely like Asian tiger parents. But the other part of it is just driven by like I mentioned, a passion for helping entrepreneurs. And in many cases, actually, to be quite honest, a big part of it is trying to help people who are doing things that I wish I could do. I fully recognize that I would not be the most amazing entrepreneur. I spent we for financial security, I basically made sure I went into banking, consulting, and so forth. And so I took sort of I didn't take the road less traveled, if you will. But part of me kind of admires and wishes that I could. And so, I think part of why I'm, excited to spend so much time in venture is really is kind of like living out a little bit of that dream, secondhand through the founder experience.
Totally. I'm just curious, so as you mentioned, you really want to help founders to succeed, as well as after 7 years in VC, do you still feel like you want to keep doing this for a long time, or do you feel like you also sometimes getting really attracted by the founder lifestyle, since you're working at a company that kind of seeing everybody else living up their quote unquote best potential. I'm not saying VCs are not best potential. It's it's a really, really comfortable job. I'm not talking about just the money side of things, but also for curious people, we're really easy to be drawn by a place where you can interact with all different sort of amazing talented people, as well as being able to having the financial stability to be able to just essentially just chatting with interesting people all day, right? Learning about interesting things. I feel like it's a really comfortable lifestyle. But do you ever wonder you wanted to just break the pattern to do things on your own?
Yeah, you're hitting on a really interesting dichotomy, which is, I think, if you're interested in venture capital, you have to be comfortable being a player coach, because you're not the one in the hot seat making the decisions. There's no way you're going to have full business context to be able to do that. And of course, if you're a VC, who you're backing at the end of the day is really the founder. It's so hard to kind of extricate a founder from the company itself. So I think you're highlighting on a really interesting dichotomy, which is to be a venture capitalist. I think you have to be comfortable being a player coach, right? You're not the one on the court, right, shooting the ball. You have to be, and you can't be, because there's no way that you as a VC have enough business context to actually make the decisions on the field. To your second question around, the other benefits of being a VC, there's no question, the two things I love about venture capital is number one, of course, working with founders. And the other is ramping up an infinite learning curve, which is to say, 1 week you could be diligencing a quantum computing company, and the next week a social network company or a vertical marketplace or what have you. And I think it takes a certain comfort with context switching and actually almost a certain ADD, right? Somebody who enjoys learning a certain topic. And once you feel like you've gotten enough depth there, moving on, as opposed to somebody who really wants to kind of just master one single thing.
Totally. Speaking of diving into a category and then becoming an expert at it, how do you kind of do the due diligence in each sector? And for SignalFire, I know you guys are really highlighting on the data there. So curious, do you want to share with us what is SignalFire, and then what makes you guys special, or what's your unfair advantage in terms of compared to other VCs and stuff like that?
Yeah, SignalFire is a different kind of animal in the venture world. We're the first venture fund that's built like a tech company end to end. So we should actually share a lot more similarities with a Google or another startup than another venture fund. And I mean that in a quite literal sense. We actually raised seed funding. We did customer validation, interviewing hundreds of founders. We hired engineers and built product and got to millions in revenue. before we raised the first fund, and then offer those same tools that we've been building and monetizing for free to the portfolio. And the premise, I can see the confusion on your face. The premise is was very much, all of us having worked at startups before and having come from venture, we had seen that once you get to 50 or 100 portfolio companies, it doesn't matter if you're John Doerr or Mark Andreessen or pick your VC. Nobody has more than an hour in a given month to really get their hands dirty and help out. But if your product was actually founder value add, you would architect yourself not necessarily as an asset money manager, but as a tech startup that can scale value. And so one of the things that we built as an example is a SaaS recruiting system that tracks 250 million people, right? And that's something that we not only give that for free to portfolio companies to help turbocharge their own recruiting, but we also eat our own dog food. And we have our own talent agency that we plug into that same tool to help make placements on behalf of our startups. And those people are people like Atani Kranz, who's the ex-chief talent officer of Netflix, so one of the authors of the famous Culture Deck, or Mike Mangini, who used to run executive recruiting for Sheryl and Trev at Facebook. Right? So amazing people who you would typically find in an operating company. And we're basically productizing those people, right? Automating the top of funnel lead gen, where they can just focus on last mile, which is really meeting highly qualified kind of pre-vetted candidates from the system and working directly with founders to help them up-level their talent game as it relates to building their own recruiting muscle.
Totally. I feel like after I became a founder myself, I feel like hiring is definitely like one of the most hardest part I could never imagine. I feel like I know so many people, but like there's no one I can like actually just hire on the spot. It's just like basically I feel like it's really interesting.
One of the things we built, and you mentioned kind of talent is the lifeblood of startups, regardless of what sector you're in, what stage. And so while we built many tools, I think the one that we're probably most known for is on the talent side. And it's basically a SaaS recruiting tool that lets you source any number of candidates based on their quality. We run sort of modified page algorithms to grade the quality of different, especially technical talent. That's sort of a forte, given that there's more data sets to sort of accurately assess quality, along with real-time predictions of who's likely to change jobs. And we build sort of full workflow integrations into SaaS ETS systems as well. So that workflow allows you to effectively create a much more nuanced and targeted search than you would otherwise be able to within existing talent tools. So that's one of the many products. We built other products as well that help on talent. And like I mentioned, we don't just provide a pure technology solution. We consider ourselves sort of a human in the loop startup ourselves. So we also plug that same tool into our own talent team, which can help make high priority placements and actually, probably more importantly, teach you how to fish for yourself as it relates to standing up your own recruiting function, right? Everything from interviewing best practices, how do you stand up your own ATS system? How do you make sure you set up your right retention system, all that kind of stuff, candidate experience. Those are all things, organizational design. Those are all things that founders have tons of questions on, and you can't get better than people like Atani Kranz who helped stand this up at Netflix.
I feel like each startup is like really, I definitely feel like the high quality talent pool is like such a draw. It can save you like so much time and energy into like, I guess like you can just pick from the better ones. But I feel like as a startup, you really need to have like a unique talent strategy. Do you see people within your own like ecosystem to fight over the same talents? Like, let's say to a SignalFire company, like just like fighting over someone that's in the talent pool, or? Yeah,
that's an interesting question. We actually get that a lot when we're talking to potential companies that we're potentially working with. The reality is, like I mentioned, we track something like 250 million people, and the hiring pool is so much greater than the size of our portfolio. We would just be a drop in the bucket. But in fact, this is actually part of the reason we wanted to become a venture fund. I think the number one question we often get asked is, why didn't you just stay a startup and sell these tools to the ecosystem, right? And part of the reason is, if you have a proprietary edge, our philosophy is you should trade on that information directly, right? So if you think about the public markets, for example, you'd rather be like a Rentec or a successful hedge fund
Mhm.
than Gartner Research, who sells information to everybody, but once you do so, it's no longer a differentiator. So that's kind of our philosophy. And because we're a high conviction lead with such a concentrated portfolio of companies, you know, that scenario where we have companies kind of going toe to toe over the exact same candidates is actually pretty rare. And one of the benefits of our model of having a concentrated portfolio.
So I have a question for you. So like you joined the fund like 7 years ago when I believe like, you know, when like Chris was starting this fund, and then like back in time, like you know, you heard about this from him and then you joined the firm, right? So basically it was like before the fund started. So curious, like like because back in time, you probably have a lot of other choices too. How did you pick to join this fund? And then like I think staying in any fund or anywhere for like 7 years is like a really big commitment. I guess like how did it evolve from like day one when you were, I don't know if you were the first hire, but like as like the core founding team to now you guys seems like a really big company now, like, you know, how, I guess like what are some factors that draw you into this?
Yeah, when I first talked to Chris, he basically pitched me the best of both worlds, if you will. The ability to be an operator, right? Like working within a company that operates like a tech company, where we have a common goal between the team, right? Shipping product, but at the same time, kind of retaining the part of venture that I love, working with founders and ramping up an infinite learning curve. Right. And so, like I mentioned, I had a bit of that traditional experience, venture experience, working at Kleiner before. And it was, you know, I'm very grateful to my time at Kleiner, incredibly smart folks, but traditional venture is it's often very lonely. Right. And at SignalFire, I think we play more of a team sport. We like to say we play soccer more than we play tennis, in part because we have, you know, we have so many, you know, we actually have a technology platform that we can collaborate around, as an example. But we, you know, we make sure that we shape the systems, the processes, and the kind of the people we hire in the culture in a way that's oriented towards our goals.
Totally. When I guess like when at the beginning you mentioned like, you know, you were hired by this founder of this fund, and then obviously you have a really great network. Who do you consider as your personal board of advisors? And my second question is, so I feel like you mentioned a really interesting point in one of your other interviews was someone asked you like, you know, how do you like kind of vet the founder, and then your answer were like, you know, maybe chatting with like their previous employer or something. Sometimes the best founders have like a negative review from their boss.
Yeah.
I mean, what is that? Like why is that? I just feel like that was like really funny. And then do you really feel like if a person work at a big tech company or like went to a certain school will help them succeed more than like a person just like doesn't really have those big names?
Yeah. So it's actually very common, to your point, to do a reference on somebody and hear one that's negative in tone, but actually maybe suggest that they'd be a really good founder. And the reason is, of course, the environment of a big tech company is very different from starting your own company. There's a lot of people who don't necessarily play nice with others, but they have the wrong ingredients to be a great founder. They may be, they may have really high horsepower, right? Really great kind of go-getter attitude. But at a big tech company, it might just be the case that you need to do a lot more cross-team communication, right, to actually get something done. And a lot of founders may not care for that because they just want to go and do it. And that may ruffle, you know, feathers the wrong way in many cases. So when we're doing references on founders, sometimes a negative reference that nonetheless highlights strengths, right, that align with what a founder needs to do could be the best reference.
That's a really interesting point that you've made. Do you feel like having a traditional, like some sort of like traditional success kind of lead you to be a better founder or not? Because we see a Steve Jobs, but we will also see a Bill Gates, right? Like, you know, someone will be really unconventional, but someone will be, you know, the ones who went to Harvard, you know, have like lawyer parents, blah, 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 right? Like, so do you think those are correlated, or like, do you feel like the ones that with a big degree or like work at better companies are the ones that who will more likely to make it, or it doesn't really say anything?
I think it can help to a degree. And here's what I mean by that. there's a lot of valuable things that you can learn from working at a big tech company, right? Just basic business communication, right? As an example, and maybe that sounds obvious for a lot of people listening, but I can tell you, as like as a math person who was like very much stuck in my own head, it was really helpful to spend a couple of years at McKinsey just from that standpoint. And I think, learning some of the basics of product management, understanding how to really, really understand customer needs and translate that into a product solution. I think some of those skills, they definitely do translate. When I say it helps to a degree, I think here's my take, is a little bit of experience to get the basic foundation of how do you actually communicate in business context? How do you hire? How do you fire? How do you manage? Those sorts of things I think are very valuable. But you don't want to stay at a large tech company so long such that you become inculcated in what it takes to succeed at a big tech company. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
You're going to start to prioritize. You're going to start to develop skills that are make you effective in that environment. But you're going to maybe be too set in your ways, right? Where you're going to have to be much more fluid, right? In a startup environment where you're going to have to you're going to have to iterate fast. And so I think it's funny. Somebody had asked. I think one of my friends actually did a study on what ex-McKinsey founders were most successful, and the study showed that the probability of success was actually like an S curve. Meaning, if you had a few years of experience and you got to sort of like mid-manager, engagement manager level, those were the people who were most likely to succeed. But once you got more senior than that and you got closer to partner, your chances of success actually dropped. And the reason is, I think the reason is, if you have a few years of experience, if you have a few years of experience, you actually can pick up some of those basic business fundamentals, but you're not quite, you're not a lifer at McKinsey yet, where you're set in the ways, in the McKinsey way, if you will. And so I think that's kind of the sweet spot where you've got, I think a few years of experience can be really helpful.
I think what you said makes a lot of sense. Like, get enough training so that you understand how to function with other people. And then once you get hung out of it and then like get out before it's like too late, I guess. I mean, I'm just curious, like you have such a great network. Like when you talk about, like you work at all these like really amazing companies, as well as like, meeting founders every day. Who do you consider as on your personal board of advisors?
When it comes to a lot of the career decisions we talked about, I have to give a lot of credit to my wife. She's very successul in her own right, probably more so than me. Yeah. I know, I have to make sure I'm careful what I say. No, she's the product lead for Core Messenger at WhatsApp, and she as she likes to remind me, she knows me better than I know myself in many cases. So she's been fantastic to kind of bounce things off of. I think I've also just been lucky to have really great coworkers and peers along the way who know me well enough to be able to kind of be a sounding board in career decisions.
Totally. Do you intentionally select like who you consult, or like do you feel like it was just more of a natural decisions because of like you've already got into places that kind of like pre-filtered that these people are kind of aligned with where you are?
Yeah, I have to say, in many cases the decisions weren't all that hard. To be honest, I like to think the best jobs are the ones that you've sort of highly pre-selected yourself for. You've kind of raised your hand for them already in the actions that you've taken to lead up to that, right? So, as an example, within venture capital, there is, when I talked to Chris Farmer originally, he was looking for somebody who had consulting experience, so could kind of contribute on the revenue side of the business at the time, right? Somebody who had some startup experience and somebody who had venture experience and could transition over to investing once we raised the fund. And that's a pretty short list of folks, thankfully. And so, I didn't have to compete against too many other people, I think. And some of the best roles are the ones that, there's the intersection of whatever you bring. There's just not that long of a list of people who meet that. That's kind of what I think. So in many cases, I think, that the Kleiner job was very similar in that at the time Kleiner was making a lot of clean tech investing, And I had done some research at McKinsey, ironically,
Mhm.
on the future of energy demand. So that
Mhm.
that kind of I think unique, maybe qualified me, gave me a little bit of an edge for those sorts of jobs. And in many cases, I think that's kind of like how the serendipity has played out. Is it's big, once something has opened up, it's been sort of it was obvious that maybe those are jobs that you kind of raise your hand in advance for.
How do you kind of like build up your own like unfair advantage throughout the way? Like, what do you consider as your like superpower? Besides
I-
like being very intellectual and articulate and all that.
Yeah, I think I'm probably a little bit more patient
Mm-hmm.
than other folks who and I think you have to be in venture capital where it could take 10 to 15 years before you actually know if a company is going to return capital. And so the feedback cycle is frustratingly long.
Mm-hmm.
And that's something that I've always been okay with working on kind of a 10 or 20-year plan. If that makes sense. I've been okay with doing jobs volunteering for startups just to get experience for free. I've been okay with working in areas maybe where I didn't feel like they were good long-term fits, but I knew that they would give me a good skill, like McKinsey, for example, learning effective communication in a business sense. I think that's probably one thing that's been I think that's one thing that's been helpful and be able in getting to this point. For sure, I've had a lot of sideways steps, like where I'm making lateral career moves as opposed to an upward trajectory, to be quite honest. And I think I'm more okay with that, with having a long-term view.
Yeah, for sure. I think that's really interesting. I think that's a really unique and really helpful skill to have. I think it's really good that like, you can convince yourself and then to do all the work to get in because, getting into McKinsey, like I don't know how many practice interviews you have to do to go in because it's insane. After you enter like the VC scene, right? Like, so let's talk about the interesting part, which is like your content creation journey. Like, do you feel like nowadays, I feel like nowadays every VC is having like a podcast, a newsletter, or like some sort of like content going on to like differentiate themselves. But I think you truly differentiate yourself because of like, as we chat about like, before the pre like, Gary Tan or like Justin Khan era, there was like absolutely no VCs on YouTube. Like, and then you're like one of the first. And then now I think you're doing pretty well. Like, I mean, I saw your video and then like my friends were seeing your videos. Like, how do you kind of like started this niche? And do you feel like content creation is kind of like a must now
Yeah,
for
yeah,
everybody?
yeah. Thank you for those comments. I feel like I'm still getting started, so I really appreciate the early encouragement. I think it's being a content creator is there. Look, there are plenty of amazing investors with no social footprint whatsoever. So I don't think it's required. I would say though that the founders more and more are expecting to be able to go online and see a little bit more of the human side, like who you are, what you stand for, and what you can offer founders. And I do think that in the long run, investors who don't do that may be left behind.
Totally. Can you talk about like how do you come up with this many ideas to talk about? Like you have like a lot of videos, and I feel like although it looks 10 minutes, like people who doesn't make video probably don't know this. Like each of your 10 minutes video, you have to spend like hours after hours after hours to like, plan, to shoot, to script, to, like edit. Yeah. I feel like this is just like a lot of work. How do you kind of like get yourself into the zone and then like what is your creative process?
Yeah, so the way I do this is I break it up into sort of idea generation, the actual production shooting, right, and then post production. And I have a really long file. It's funny. It's because the videos I put out, I probably have a Google Doc of I think it's at like 300 ideas, and it's just stuff that it's having the presence of mind to jot down things as you're going through your day, because there's so much content out there. There's so many interesting ideas that you hear from other people that as long as you have the presence of mind, I think there are plenty of ideas that present themselves if you have that frame of thinking of like always being looking out for ideas. On the rest of it, that stuff takes a ton of time, so I have to batch it. On the production side, I'm usually scripting for an afternoon, like once every couple weeks. I'll script 3 or 4 videos, then I'll shoot them all the following week, and then I will do post production. on all of them, kind of, whenever I can find the time. That's the one that I honestly I haven't figured out how to fit into my workflow, because the post-production can take dozens of hours, depending.
Totally.
And I've done I think I made a mistake in trying to follow the pattern of what a founder should do, which is own everything until you find product market fit. Because I do think that you can outsource some things like editing
Yeah,
and
for sure.
graphics.
Yeah, totally. I think like, but I truly feel like your production level is like literally on the next level. I can see that as an audience. I don't think like anyone else will know what you're trying to tell like as good as you, as well as like all your like music selection, as well as like the B-rolls. I feel like they're all really on point to do the training part to make sure that people who understand what's the style that you're trying to communicate, as well as like, using what and where. But I do admire like the amount of work that you have put into to like make the videos like really just like really on point.
Thank you.
In terms of like investing in founders, like you talked about, like, the kind of characteristic you look for example, the agility, the being able to, the endurance or like the grit, as well as like, do they have like the quick learning kind of ability. So I'm curious, like, you use like the founder of Tempo as an example, right? Like because of he is he meets all these traits in his stories. But I feel like when like I worked in venture, I feel like it was not really that obvious. I'm curious, like, how do you kind of like judge these kind of traits at the beginning, as well as like I feel like asking for like a reference call, like especially the founders can always pick their 3 best friends who like gave some good words, but like yeah, like you mentioned like a really interesting thing about like maybe hear like their mistake or something and then like see what people are saying. But like I'm just curious, like how do you quickly filter out the people's like quality?
Yeah, to your point, I think referencing somebody is a bit an art form itself, meaning who you contact and how you ask them questions actually matters a lot, right? You want to ask open-ended questions so that, for example, if somebody claims that they were instrumental in a specific product launch, you don't ask that of a person who worked, who should have worked with them. You just say, who was most helpful in this product launch, and just see who they name. Right. Okay. And if it's true, then they should name this person. And the other thing is, I think it's really helpful to do off-list references, right? Which is people who aren't necessarily the first person that a founder or somebody else would give you. So I think that's a topic that we could talk a lot about, the kind of the art of referencing of how do you actually what's the process by which you get to the truth? When it comes to looking for founder qualities like learning agility, grit, and so forth, I'm kind of of the mind that if somebody is an outlier in some of these traits, they must have shown it at some point in their lives, even if they're super young and they've never had a job before, right? If you in the case of Moya, who you referenced, the founder of Tempo, he young first-time founder, but the grit is just oozing out of his pores, right? He's a guy who he spent he was homeless for years in high school, put himself through college, right? But yeah, we're not necessarily, at some level you have to take founders' word for it, for sure, to the extent that we can try to validate these things. That's where kind of the art of the reference comes in.
I guess the other question is like, when you're like identifying these founders, like besides the most obvious ones or like his experience or something, I think another part is like, can they execute? I think a lot of it was just sales skills, right? Like it was just like, how do you present yourself, and then how do you kind of like convince people to give you money, or like convince people? I think like there when I was interviewing a ton of VC for my book back in time, a lot of them kind of said like sales is a really critical skill, because you have to sell yourself to your investors, sell your company to like potential people who are the talents that are going to join, or like getting the clients. I think But however, I feel like building a really successful company, sales is just like one part of the game. As like, eventually when people buy your product, they have to not hate your product, right? Like, so out of curiosity, like, I feel like those skills are kind of like hard. And then like, do you pick the founder with every skill kind of, or do you pick the founder with one skill specifically that's like top?
Yeah, we found we've had a lot more success backing founders who we kind of call the two-legged stool, if you will. So they're really good at certain things. As long as they're self-aware of where they are not as strong, they can complement right with other founders. And I think that's actually much better. It's much easier to have somebody who's really good at two things versus mediocre at all of them, because you can't really hire around that kind of person as easily, right? If that makes sense.
Totally. When you are looking at their track record, let's say like I'm a founder and I came to you, unless you're like at the very, very beginning raising like seed angel money or whatever, like it's really hard to like just come with no track record at all, right? Like, but however, like I feel like the more time that you spend on your company, the more track record you kind of have to show. However, without money, that's kind of like hard to show, right? Like because of a lot of things are with money, it's a lot easier to like hire someone else to do 5 other things. So then like you're doing like everything yourself. I guess like how do you kind of like do the check, or like how do you kind of qualify their ability with the amount of money or like the circumstance they have?
So one of the things that we look for, and this goes back to your point about sales, the importance of sales, but it being just like one of the one of the things you need to do as a founder. I think one thing that's really helpful for a founder is the ability to go high and low. By which I mean you can be high level and you can distill what you're doing as a business to its essence and communicate it in a way that like I or somebody else who's not fully informed, not an expert in the space, can understand it really easily. But also be able to kind of go down in the weeds on, what it takes, what it actually takes to build the product and the business. And being able to kind of hold both of those levels in your head at the same time, I think is a really valuable founder skill.
Totally. What are some founders that you've seen that are at the beginning, they seems great, and then like later on they turn out to be the opposite? Let's say like, at the beginning they were looks very like, not like the traditional successful founder looking, but eventually they turn out to be the unicorn founders.
Yeah, I feel like this is really topical with like Adam Neumann's second company and the trial of Theranos and so forth. I think one of the things that's hard is the line between genius and fraud is very thin. By which I mean people who have a lot of the best founders have these reality distortion fields where they're trying to see 5 to 10 years in the future, right? And they have a vision of that, and they're trying to basically pull that forward into reality and convince everybody else of that. And a lot of the best founders have this quality where they can get other people to suspend disbelief, if you will, and buy into that vision. And that bleeds into I think the line between that and jazz hands, right? Like as they say, like somebody who's just like good at sales for sales sake, is sometimes hard to decipher. We'll put it that way. I think the jury's still out on many of these famous founders who have potentially raised billions of dollars, and it's a question of it's questionable on how good of a steward of capital they've been to investors.
So you've been in 7 years. Like I feel like when I was working in like venture as an associate, like so my perspective on that, it was kind of like it's got Groundhog Day kind of thing. So it's like kind of it's also sales. Like you are out there selling yourself to the top founders who doesn't need your money, and then you sell yourself to your boss. Technically, they're gonna be like, you're gonna try to convince them that like you think ABC are gonna make it or something, and then essentially I feel like it's a sales job, or like at least like at the beginning when you're younger.
Yeah.
But when you get older, you have more decision power, and then you can just be, I guess, like on the next level. But like, I'm just curious, like, what was your experience like 7 years from the beginning to, who you are now?
Yeah, you're right. The job changes a lot. And in the
Mhm.
beginning, when you're in the process of trying to, build up your own kind of area of expertise
Mhm.
and trying to make new investments, there is a really heavy sales part to the job. Over time, once you build up a portfolio of companies you're working with,
Mhm.
a lot of the job shifts, right? And you're spending a lot more time with companies
Mhm.
trying to help them, not necessarily making decisions, but helping them, especially, for as an example, during the pandemic or the recent economic crash, we and most VCs are spending a ton of time working with founders on refactoring their annual plans if they need to, figuring out what adjustments do they need to make on their
Mhm.
capital raising strategy, et cetera, and making a lot of difficult trade-offs,
Mhm.
quite frankly, in many cases. So we're kind of in some ways becoming internal consultants,
Mhm.
and spending a lot more time doing that as opposed to going around, doing sales, as you
Mhm.
mentioned.
Totally. Like what are something that you are constantly trying to get better at? Like, I guess like
Mhm.
it could be like the sales skills or it could be technical skills. Like, what do you think is the most useful skill in VC that you personally are constantly putting effort in?
Yeah, I think the most underrated skill is storytelling. And this is actually a big reason why I started my YouTube channel.
Mhm.
I think a lot of business, certainly at McKinsey and other great training grounds like that,
Mhm.
they teach you to be linear storytellers, very
Mhm.
top down, right? Very logical.
Mhm.
Repeat yourself a lot,
Mhm.
right? I think most people don't work that way.
Yeah,
Most
totally.
people,
It's
the
emotional.
vast majority of people are emotional tails that wag the
Mhm.
rational dog.
Yeah.
If that makes sense. And I mean, it's I think it's just human nature, right? Like
Mhm.
so many people I knew growing up were wanted to become doctors because they watched Grey's Anatomy or something like that, as opposed to some very calculated decision where they spreadsheeted out the pros and cons of
Yeah.
every job. That's just not how most people work.
Mhm.
And I would like to be able to effectively communicate with like the vast majority of the world who are not
Mhm.
kind of like data driven people who
Mhm.
who that's how kind of they make their decisions purely rationally.
Mhm.
And I think that is that's such a valuable skill generally, and the way that it translates into venture capital, if you can, I think one of the most underrated skills in venture capital is
Mhm.
being able to take in everything you're hearing from a founder and reflect back a story to them of what they're trying to do in a way that
Mhm.
demonstrates that you potentially buy in or understand certain parts of their business maybe even better than they do. And that's a skill that I certainly I certainly look to a lot of people in the industry as being really good at that. I'll give a shout out to Josh Constein,
Mhm.
who's a former managing editor at
Yeah.
TechCrunch.
Mhm.
He's phenomenal at this. Basically, being able to kind of like repackage and translate what a founder is saying and repackage it in a super compelling way that the
Mhm.
founder said. It reflects, of course, on his comprehension of what they're doing, but
Yeah.
it's also a gift in the sense that, as you mentioned, being a founder is a very sales heavy job. And to the extent that you can help founders with storytelling, like give them a nugget for how you could
Mhm.
explain this
Mhm.
better to a candidate, to a potential customer, that's a really valuable skill in itself. It makes sense that founders are astute in the day-to-day
Mhm.
of their companies, and VCs, while they definitely don't understand your business better than you do,
Mhm.
they are spending a lot of their time like with a bunch of different companies,
Mhm.
and it would make sense that they could potentially make connections, right, to other areas or see other companies that have kind of
Mhm.
been able to kind of expand the scope of what they've been able to do.
Totally. What is like your day to day like? Besides like, meeting up with like a lot of founders. Also like I'm just on the other hand, I feel like when I was working in venture, I feel like when you're having a lot of first time, like I call them like, the first date conversation as like it's like, oh, tell me about your story. Tell me about why did you start the company? And then like show me your product. I feel like those conversations happens like 99% times, like maybe just 1% you actually go deeper to follow up and then actually like um digging deeper into it. Like I guess like do you get tired of like hearing like a bunch of company like all the time in the first time hearing about them, or do you feel like do you have like any kind of system yourself to use to like track these companies or like follow up or I guess like,
Mhm.
just like keeping things on track?
Yeah, no, to your first question, no, it doesn't get old. In part because things change so fast in the technology world, as you know, right? And the ingenuity of well, first off, the scope of problems that need to be solved and human ingenuity knows no limits. So I think that makes for an endlessly interesting job. What is true is it can be exhausting just in the cognitive switching that I mentioned, which is to say, you may have to bounce between a quantum computing company and a social network and some SaaS marketplace, et cetera. That part can be exhausting at times. But I think to your transition to your second question, you do have to make sure you have the systems in place to be able to scale the number of meetings, right? And so I think having for me, that's just managing my workflow through my inbox with with a bunch of templates and things like that. And then to your first question on sort of like the broad split of your day, it is helpful to kind of have large blocks of time for sort of the three different buckets that you're doing within venture, right? Which is meeting new companies, spending time with the founders you're working with, and sort of the rest of kind of like working with your team internally as it relates to helping the team make investment decisions, partner meetings, collaborating with other folks. At SignalFire, we tend to have more internal meetings because we have more cross-team collaboration as it relates to interfacing with our own internal products.
How many percent of your day is spending chatting with founder, and how much of it was kind of like self-reflecting, like studying a certain sector and then like catching up with other people, as well as like, when you are meeting these founders, do you feel like the warm introduction were still like like gonna give you the best quality deal, or were those maybe people? I think cold reach is probably really hard to pick someone who's actually good, but like maybe you are going after them, like you heard about them somewhere and then you kind of pitch them.
Yeah, I would say a lot of the best deals that we've done have been cold outreach on our side. Right, which is to say, like, we're going out and searching for a deal, trying to get in front of a founder. For sure, I think that's very much the case for, in my opinion, most new funds. If you're a Sequoia or somebody else who's been around for a long time, right? It just takes a long time to build a brand in venture because, as I mentioned, it takes 10 to 15 years for a company from seed to IPO kind of thing. So I think maybe for some of those funds, there's a little bit more inbound, but I think for new fund managers, it's really important to kind of be out there trying to get in front of companies.
Totally. When you are pitching the companies, like how many percent of them you end up investing in them, or you end up like them letting you invest in them? And then how many percent are like the ones that are just gonna be like a random conversation you had that day? Let's say you pitch 10 company that, hey, like we think your company is doing something really interesting. Do you want to have a conversation? How many people actually, I guess like everybody probably just took the conversation, but how many of them in the end you end up investing in them?
Yeah, I would say the funnel for us probably looks like several thousand companies that we consider on some level. Maybe we're not doing deep diligence on every single one of them. But we'll look at several thousand. We'll probably meet something on the order of hundreds and make make a handful of investments every year. We're this answer it varies by your strategy. There's some funds that try to be a little bit more of an index where they're writing smaller checks, and they probably have much more active funnels, if you will, and are making much higher velocity decisions. In our case, because we are leading or co-leading in almost every case, at least at the seed stage, that means that for any individual person, investor at the fund, you might just be making a few investments per year.
How do you heard about these companies in the first place? Were they raising money, or would you convince them to take your money, or like how does it work?
There's a number of different ways that you hear about companies. I think some of the best ways are through the founders that you're working with already, right? Once you've built up enough of a reputation with them, right? They can speak firsthand to how you can help another founder.
Mhm.
That's the best reference that you could possibly have, in our opinion. And I think it's why I'm so vested in SignalFire's approach of investing everything in the bottom of the funnel, which is to say, post company support, right? So that's in my opinion the best source. But no question, we and most VCs out there are going to try to pull from wherever you can find founders. Whether that's I'll give you another example of a way that we try to do sourcing a little bit differently. There's this concept of market mapping, which you may have heard of in venture capital, where you take a look at a certain technology shift or a certain industry or sector, what have you, and you try to map out kind of like what's the inflection point and what companies are potentially positioned really well to take advantage. And we will at SignalFire, we're going to make sure that when we're doing that, we're going to leverage. We're going to do kind of like what we would call an MRI slice, which is to say we're going to find the people who have an A+ perspective on each of the different elements of a thesis, right? Which is to say there may be somebody who's really, really deep in the customer pain point. There may be somebody else who's really deep in kind of what a technology like GPT-3 is really capable of, and so on and so forth. And we'll leverage SignalFire's network of 70 different advisors who kind of cross every functional area and every industry to do that. And then the other thing is we also have another slice that we can uniquely do on the data side, which is we can understand bottoms up, right? Talent flows, financial flows, customer buying behavior, and so forth, which we can use to kind of inform our own theses. So that's another way in which you can programmatically create a macro market map. And then out of that kind of source interesting investment opportunities.
Totally. So there are listeners who are actually probably like solo GP or like starting their own fund or like, just younger people working in venture. So if they want to start a successful fund, what would you say would be the best approach right now? Like, SignalFire is doing these like, basically post-investing category of like helping funders and like, but there's the A16Z of the world who are just marketing machine and like having a lot of assets to like invest right away, and like what are something that like younger people should be looking into when they're trying to recreate the next generation fund?
Yeah, I think you have to approach it like a startup has to think about what is their unfair advantage, right? And what is their defensibility. And for the good news is in venture, it's not a winner take all market, and there's no one strategy that works, right? You could have a strategy that says I'm very tightly knit into the Stripe ecosystem, and I'm going to make sure I see every company that comes out of that, or the Airbnb community, etc. That's certainly a valid strategy. There's you could be a very deep domain expert in life sciences or something like. I think there's infinite permutations of strategies where you can build a competitive edge.
Who would you hire if you start a fund? Who would be your first hire?
I'm going to go back to what I mentioned about founders, which is we look for founders that are two-legged stools, founders who have like really extreme strengths in some dimension and are self-aware enough to complement themselves with a co-founder who can fill in the gaps. And I would do the same thing if I was starting a new fund, which is it would depend on the person and what they bring to the table, right? And you're going to be looking to complement yourself with. Now, if you happen to be like a GP in a box, a solo GP in a box, if you will, where you have a competitive advantage in sourcing and picking and winning and so forth, like top to bottom, then maybe the first hire would be a chief of staff, somebody who could free up your time to focus on what you uniquely do well.
Totally. Thank you so much for sharing like all these like amazing insights. I feel like it's just really nice to chat about like, from both the angle of like a VCS about like a startup founder. And then I think like it's really nice to like just like, like learn from someone who have like chatted with like a million founders and then, have been in the industry for a period of time, but still fairly like very hands-on. So, okay. So last question is, it's a mini fire round question. So number one is, what's your favorite book?
My favorite book is probably The Banality of Evil. And I don't mean that from an enjoyment standpoint. I just think it's an important book, which which talks about how not questioning is 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 really kind of the source of a lot of history's atrocities. It's more a commentary on kind of like human psychology, human nature.
Interesting. I'm definitely gonna check it out. Who made the biggest impact in your career?
Well, it's my parents and then more recently my wife.
Who will you met to your dinner party?
Definitely Roger Federer and Manny Pacquiao. Those are some of my heroes.
Okay, so where can we find you outside of work?
You can find me at a tennis court, or I spend a lot of time at home with my kids.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Wayne, for coming on the show today.
Yeah, thanks so much for having me.
Thank you for listening to this week's episode. If you enjoyed today's episode, please hit the subscribe button so you don't miss out. Have a wonderful day.